Chapter 24 of Christianity in the Apostolic Age. Christianity in the Apostolic Age by George Purves. The Last Years of the Apostle Peter. 283. It remains to sketch briefly the progress of Christianity outside of and subsequent to its expansion under Paul. His influence indeed extended and may be traced in the literary remains of his contemporaries and immediate followers. Information concerning his fellow workers is, moreover, scanty and sporadic, but enough exists to afford glimpses into the course which the new religion took, its successes and its perils, its progress and its unity, until its creative period drew to a close. We naturally inquire first concerning the work of Paul's chief fellow apostle Simon Peter. 284. The life of Peter after the council at Jerusalem is wrapped in obscurity. The tradition first mentioned by Eusebius, that he went to Rome during the reign of Claudius, AD 41-54, and died under Nero in the same year with Paul, still more that, as reported by Jerome, he was the head of the Roman Church for 25 years, is inconsistent, save as regards the time of his death, with the data furnished by the New Testament books. Shortly after the council we find him at Antioch, Galatians 1 verse 11, see section 162. This was probably in AD 51, and Paul's epistle to the Romans, AD 57 or 58, section 232, forbids the supposition that Peter had then been labouring in the capital, not only by its silence about him, but still more by Paul's declared principle not to enter on another's territory, 2 Corinthians 10 verse 16, Romans 15 verses 20-24. Paul, however, alludes to Peter as a missionary well known to the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 9 verse 6. It is not probable indeed that Peter had then visited Corinth. True, Dionysius of Corinth, AD 160, mentions him, as well as Paul, as one who had planted Christianity in that city, but if his statement rested on fact, it is more probable that Peter did not visit Corinth until after Paul's epistles to that church had been written. The agreement between Paul and the leaders of the Jerusalem church, Galatians 2 verse 9, makes it certain that in the years immediately following the council, Peter's work lay among the Jews, and since James was at the head of affairs in Judea, among the Jews of the dispersion. If Babylon, from which 1 Peter was written, 5 verse 13, is to be understood literally, we infer that the apostle went to the Far East, and in any event, that was a natural direction for him to take. The absence of his name also from the epistles written by Paul during his first Roman imprisonment makes it still further improbable that he had visited the capital as late as AD 63. 285. Yet the tradition that Peter finally suffered martyrdom at Rome is too early and constant to be rejected. His martyrdom itself is obviously attested by John, chapter 21, verses 18 and 19. His death is associated with Paul's by Clement of Rome, AD 96. Ignatius, AD 110, wrote to the Romans, "I do not command you as Peter and Paul." Dionysius of Corinth, AD 160, mentions the two apostles as having taught together in Italy and suffered martyrdom at or about the same time, and thereafter the tradition appears universally accepted. Tradition, moreover, associated Mark's gospel with Peter's preaching and assigned to that gospel a Roman origin. We must believe, therefore, that after Paul's release, and hence after his establishment of Gentile Christianity, Peter turned to the west and finally went to the capital. This implies that the division of fields of labor ceased when the unity of Jew and Gentile in the church became an accomplished and recognized fact, and such is the intimation of Paul himself in the epistle to the Ephesians, chapter 2 verses 14-22, chapter 3 verse 5, chapter 4 verses 1-16. 286. The exact date, however, of Peter's death is a matter of doubt. The prevalent belief of the early church was that he died under Nero in AD 67 or 68. The death under Nero is implied in the statement of Dionysius of Corinth that he died at or about the same time as Paul, and this tradition became so fixed that in the 4th century the two apostles were said to have suffered on the same day. The later form of the report is, however, quite untrustworthy, and even the general fact, though well attested, has been disputed. Thus Professor Ramsay thinks that since one Roman tradition, preserved in Tertullian, declared that Peter ordained Clement as head of the Roman Church, the earliest belief must have been that the apostle survived the reign of Nero. But this inference is precarious, since we do not know to what date That tradition assigned the ordination of Clement, and since the other tradition, assigning Peter's death to Nero's reign, was more prevalent. On the other hand, Harnack would date the death of both Peter and Paul as early as AD 64, the year of the outbreak of Nero's persecution, but the reasons for this date, so far as concerns Peter, are not convincing, and are acknowledged to be inconsistent with the claims of 1 Peter to be the work of the apostle. See Appendix. It is most probable, therefore, that the common tradition is approximately correct, and that Peter suffered in Rome towards the close of Nero's reign. That he was crucified seems to be implied, though not certainly, in John 21 verses 18 and 19. This is all that history knows. Further particulars about his death belong to the realm of legend. 287. His first epistle discloses in a lively way both the teaching of the apostle and the condition of Christianity among the provinces of Asia Minor to the disciples in which it was addressed, 1 verse 1. The apostle implies that he himself had not evangelized his readers, 1 verse 12. They were for the most part of Gentile origin, 1 verses 14, 18, 21, 2 verse 10, 4 verse 3, and the description of them as the elect who are sojourners of the dispersion, 1 verse 1, Revised Version, is due to the complete transfer of the idea of Israel to the Christian community. See 1 verse 17, 2 verses 5, 9 to 11. Their situation was one of increasing temptation and peril. Their faith in the risen Lord was exposed to sore trial, 1 verse 7. They needed to realize the duty of sober and steadfast hope of the glory to come, 1 verse 13. In particular, did they need to refute by their lives the charge of being evildoers, chapter 2 verse 12, chapter 3 verse 16, to prove their loyalty to civil authority, chapter 2 verses 13 to 15, and to act well as members of society, chapter 2 verses 16 to 18, chapter 3 verse 7. They were evidently suspected by their pagan neighbors and were liable to suffer through gross misrepresentations, chapter 3 verse 15. The writer warns them to be willing to suffer, but that they must not give just occasion for it, chapter 3 verse 17. In fact, they must prepare for a more fiery trial than any they had known, chapter 4 verse 12. They might well rejoice if called to suffer for being Christians, chapter 4 verse 16, remembering the like sufferings of their brethren elsewhere, chapter 5 verse 9. But they must be careful not to be guilty of any real offence, lest they dishonour the cause for which they stand. 288. These exhortations point to a time when the prosecution of Christians by the civil authorities was a real possibility, yet it is clear that other charges than their Christianity were likely to be made against them as the ground of the prosecution. This situation corresponds to what we know of the period which followed the outbreak of Nero's attack upon the Christians of Rome. At first they were punished ostensibly for alleged crimes against society. Soon, however, Christianity itself became a crime. The combination of the earlier and the later phase of the government's hostility is plainly the situation presented by the epistle. We see no reason, however, to believe with Professor Ramsay that the proscription of the name did not become the established policy of the Roman government till after the reign of Nero. Suetonius testifies that in Nero's police regulations, Christians as such were classed with common criminals, and that implies that Christianity was already regarded as practically the proof of crime. Our epistle may therefore be placed shortly after the outbreak of Nero's persecution in AD 65 or 66. We do not know indeed from other sources that the persecution extended to the provinces, neither do we know that it did not. Naturally, it would at least influence the attitude of provincial officers toward the sect which the emperor himself had denounced. The epistle, moreover, speaks of persecution rather as impending than as present. There can be little doubt that the hatred of the Roman populace against the Christians was echoed in the provinces, and that when once the imperial government had set the example, lower officials would be ready to listen to similar charges, and in some instances to initiate action. 289. Christianity, therefore, was, for the first time so far as our records show, called on to face the hostility of the empire and of Roman society. It was the beginning of the conflict which was to last for 2.5 centuries. The first fierce outbreak, which the Roman historian, see section 1, records in condensed but clear language, had already occurred. Its echoes were being heard throughout the world. Christianity could only try to meet the emergency by following the exhortation of Peter to lives of such purity as would disarm enmity and prove the value to the state and to humanity of the new religion. With the rising danger, moreover, the Christian brotherhood in all lands was drawn more closely together, and the common faith received fresh emphasis. Accordingly, in Peter's epistle, the influence of earlier Christian writings is plainly manifest. He betrays the influence upon him of both James. Compare, for example, chapter 1 verse 6 and James 1 verse 2 and 3, chapter 1 verse 7 and James chapter 1 verse 3 and chapter 5 verse 5, and James 1 verse 3, chapter 5 verse 5 and James 4 verse 6, chapter 4 verse 8 and James 5 verse 20, and Paul. Acquaintance with the epistle to the Ephesians is especially evident. Compare chapter 1 verses 3 and 4, and Ephesians chapter 1 verse 3, chapter 1 verse 5 and Ephesians 1 verse 19, chapter 1 verse 20 and Ephesians 1 verse 4, chapter 2 verses 5 and 6 and Ephesians 2 verses 20 to 22, chapter 3 verse 22 and Ephesians 1 verse 21, also chapter 5 verse 4 and Colossians chapter 3 verse 4, chapter 1 verse 1 and Romans 8 verse 29, chapter 1 verse 14 and Romans 12 verse 2, chapter 2 verse 10 and Romans 9 verse 25, etc. With apparent reference to the fact that his readers were mainly Pauline Christians, he closes with the injunction, "This is the true grace of God, stand ye fast therein," chapter 5 verse 12, Revised Version. The earlier division of labor had ceased. The consciousness of a common faith in the face of common perils had obliterated it. The apostle of the circumcision united with the apostle of the Gentiles in strengthening the disciples on the basis of their common relationship to the one Lord and one Church. 290. On the other hand, Peter's teaching has an individuality of its own. This epistle contains numerous reminiscences of his life with Jesus, and especially of the Lord's sufferings. Chapter 1 verse 3, 8, 21, chapter 2 verse 21 and 23, chapter 5 verses 1 and 5. In it also, as in Peter's speeches in Acts, Christianity is notably the fulfillment of prophecy, chapter 1 verses 10 to 12, and verse 25, chapter 2 verses 6 and 24, chapter 3 verse 21. And what had been fulfilled gave new eagerness to the writer's expectation of the further glory to come, chapter 1 verses 3 to 9 and verse 13, chapter 4 verses 7 and 13, chapter 5 verses 1, 4 and 10, so that he has been well called the Apostle of Hope. For him also faith is the only condition of salvation, chapter 1 verses 5, 8, 9, 21, chapter 2 verses 4 and 7, chapter 5 verse 9, but he lays stress on the historic agencies by which Christian faith had been created, chapter 1 verse 3, 21 and 23. He represents it also, like James, as faith in God revealed in Jesus Christ, chapter 1 verse 21, and as manifested in obedience, chapter 1 verse 1 and 14, chapter 2 verses 1, 7 and 15, chapter 3 verses 12 and 16, chapter 4 verses 1 and 2. He does not unfold, as Paul had done, the nature of Christ, yet not only is God the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, chapter 1 verse 3, but Jesus is made the supreme object of love, chapter 1 verses 8 and 9, as well as of faith, chapter 1 verses 8 and 9, chapter 2 verse 7, the means of access to God, chapter 2 verse 5, chapter 4 verse 11, chapter 5 verse 10, the cornerstone of the spiritual temple, chapter 2 verse 4, the sinless example, chapter 2 verses 21, 22, chapter 4 verses 1 and 13, the head of the church, chapter 2 verse 25, chapter 4 verse 4, and the Lord of the universe, chapter 3 verse 22, while reference is made to his activity through the Spirit before his incarnation, chapter 1 verse 11, chapter 3 verses 19 and 20. The work of Christ is represented as consisting fundamentally in his sacrificial death, chapter 1 verses 1, 11, 18 and 19, chapter 2 verse 24, chapter 3 verse 18, chapter 4 verse 1, and in his resurrection, whereby he has entered on the exercise of his saving power, chapter 1 verses 3, 11 and 21, chapter 3 verse 21. To Peter, as to Paul, all Christians are the true Israel, but Peter is especially fond of the thought, chapter 1 verse 1, chapter 2 verses 5, 9 and 10. The epistle, therefore, has a strong individuality of its own. Its leading motive, however, is hortatory rather than didactic. It is not concerned to preserve the faith from false teaching, but from the influences of trial and temptation. This corresponds with Peter's disposition, and just because of his solicitude that the Christians might honor by their lives the name of Christ, and might not flinch before the fierce trials which threatened them, does this epistle cast a peculiarly interesting light on the situation in which, after the outbreak of persecution by the Roman authorities, the new religion found itself. 291. There were, however, perils from within as well as from without, and these both practical and theoretical. Some idea of them may be gleaned from the second epistle of Peter and from the closely allied epistle of Jude. Since the latter appears to have been written before the former and presents much the same danger in a less developed form, it may be noticed first. 292. Of Jude himself we know nothing beyond what is implied in his being one of the Lord's brethren, section 276, and an evangelist, 1 Corinthians 9 verse 5. A story was related by Hegesippus that Jude's grandchildren were summoned for examination before the suspicious Domitian because they were descendants of David. They proved themselves, however, to be hard-working farmers and declared that their faith taught them to expect only a heavenly kingdom at the end of the world. Thereupon the emperor dismissed them with contempt. If the story be true, it implies that in the reign of Domitian, AD 81 to 96, Jude himself was dead. 293. His epistle is an indignant invective against certain false disciples, and the churches into which they had intruded appear most probably to have been located in Asia, section 276. He describes them as immoral men, veritable antinomians who turned grace into lasciviousness and virtually denied the only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ, verse 4, Revised Version. Lewdness was their passion, verses 5 to 8, and was defended under the plea of higher knowledge, verses 8 to 10. They are reproved not for teaching error, but for practicing it. They mingled in the Christian feasts and even dared to take conspicuous parts, verses 12 to 16. They formed also exclusive coteries, claiming to possess the Spirit, verse 19. With great variety of rhetorical figure, Jude depicts the shameful folly of these sinful men, verses 10, 12, 13, 16 to 23. He too, like Peter, wrote in the name of the common faith, verses 3 and 20. His Jewish training appears in his illustrations not only from Hebrew history, verses 5, 7, and 11, but also from the tradition and extra-canonical literature, verses 6, 9, 14, and 15. But he appealed especially to the teaching of the apostles as the recognized authority, verses 17 and 18. His brief letter thus disclosed a new and unexpected danger to which Christianity was exposed. The doctrines of grace and liberty were liable to be grossly abused. Against such carnal influences, as well as against Judaism and speculative philosophy, did the leaders have to strive. That they did so is another evidence of the clearness and completeness with which they apprehended the faith itself. On the other hand, these alien influences reveal the agitation of society produced by Christianity and foreshadow the corruption to which in the following age some of the churches yielded. 294. In the second epistle of Peter, the same class of perils against which Jude had warned reappear along with others. The errors, however, are now positively advanced by false teachers. The epistle was doubtless written from Rome not long before the apostle's death, chapter 1 verse 14, and was addressed to the same circle, or at least to a part of it, to which the first epistle had been sent, chapter 3 verse 1. He had evidently read and used the epistle of Jude. Compare chapter 2 verse 1 and Jude 4, chapter 2 verse 4 and Jude 6, chapter 2 verse 10 and Jude 8, chapter 2 verse 11 and Jude 9, chapter 2 verse 12 and Jude 10, chapter 2 verse 13 and Jude 12, and wrote to those familiar with the epistles of Paul, chapter 3 verses 15 and 16. He tells us also, besides his references to antinomians, chapter 2 verse 1 to chapter 3 verse 3, of some who had begun to question whether the Lord would indeed return, chapter 2 verse 4. The apostle exhorts his readers to hold to the faith which they had been taught, denounces the wickedness and predicts the punishment of the false teachers, and solemnly affirms that the Lord will come, judgment will be issued, and the present world be destroyed by fire. 295. Thus we see that Gentile Christianity had no sooner been established than it was threatened with internal and external perils of the most serious kinds. Alien teaching and practical immorality appeared within, while the enmity of the empire and the suspicions of the populace loomed darkly without. There is indeed no reason to doubt that the majority of the disciples were everywhere witnessing to the holiness and spiritual power of the new life which had been begotten within them. Yet the need shown by these epistles of their being warned against the intrusions of error proves that their condition was by no means an ideal one, and forewarns us that the full establishment of the Christianity taught by the apostles was destined to be a slow and arduous process. It was in part the perception of this fact that led the latter to realize the importance for the future of their written instructions. 2 Peter 2 verse 15, 3 verses 1 and 2, and to bequeath an authoritative literature to the Church. End of chapter 24.